Good morning and welcome. We are in Senior English A, and our project now this morning, in the waning days of our senior year, is to speak about satire. Satire. Now, there will also often be associated with this word the word irony. And so as you're taking notes, and I highly recommend that you do so, you will want to write down both of those words and be in your hymnals on 596, 597. Let's talk about rhetorical purpose, shall we? When we want to say something in writing, that something we will call a thesis. How we will present our thesis is understood as rhetoric. Remember, to be. Not what the author says, but Mr. Durant, how the author says it. There are two ways to speak about delivery of your thesis, what we often will refer to as articulation of validation. To validate a thesis, to articulate, to write it down. There are two ways to do that. One way is through the front door of the house. That is to say, you have a clearly stated thesis. You have three, at least, points of validation. It's very easy to understand what is being articulated if you have a clearly stated thesis. We've been practicing writing these essays for nigh on 9 months now, or longer. There is another approach, though, and it's often what I will call through the back screen door. This one's a different project. It's not coming through the front door. It's the aluminum bat approach. You never see it coming until it hits. That's called satire. Let me give you a classic example. And it might be that my story explains why we no longer have a high school newspaper. Many years ago, Mr. McGee was in charge of the high school newspaper at Worland High. We were engaged in questions about who will write what and what kinds of stories will be involved. And I had just finished a lecture on satire and the great satirist Swift, as well as Modest Proposal, a text we'll get to in a few minutes. And one of my students said, I think I have an idea for a satiric piece. And I went, yeah, great, sure, why not? She published in the newspaper, I was unable to see it before it went to press, what became one of the most controversial essays ever to appear in the WHS Screen. This was an essay in which she pointed out that it was the spring, and that young men and young women were engaging in large amounts of public displays of affection, what often is referred to as PDA. She pointed out the obvious. It's natural that guys and girls at Worland High School would be attracted to each other and therefore want to show that affection in public ways in the hall. However, she pointed out that probably it's not the best of things for people like herself and others, namely freshmen, to have to endure watching as people engaged in this activity, and therefore she suggested a solution to the problem of PDA in the halls. And then she began to talk about the special room she wanted to have built at Worland High, where, at any given time of the day, if students so felt inclined, they should be allowed by their teachers to just simply get up, walk out of the room that they were in, and visit this room of amore, where she describes in detail the room, including a drain in the corner because we must clean up after ourselves, and everything else involved in what goes on in this room, including some kind of special dispenser of you can get the picture. Well, you can imagine how this one went over in the local high school newspaper. It was a rout. I mean, it was hilarious. Now that I have your attention, it's funny how sex does that, isn't it? Now that I have your attention, thank you. Now that I have your attention in the morning, on one of the last days of your senior year, let me point out something. Her intention was not to create this room. That was not what she was doing, although the administration came to me and asked that very question. My response to the administration was, are you at all familiar with satire? Let's now give you the most plebeian of formulations for satire. Say one thing, mean something else. Almost always, we can't say it always, but almost always, right, Miss Michaels, it's say one thing, mean the opposite. That's what we mean by satire. Got me? Say one thing, mean the opposite. My favorite example from the university of this is a student of mine who I taught, very good student, went on to the military for a while, came out of the military, and then was prepared to enroll in university. He was very bright and was accepted to the University of Colorado Boulder, a university not known for its conservative values. I'll just leave it at that. And he was placed in his first English class, and he said to me later that when he entered the class, he knew immediately something was amiss, just by the way everyone looked at him, and could immediately tell from his personae that he had just left the military, you see. And then he said the prof walked in. A woman who had hair shaved to her scalp, who refused to wear certain undergarments, and was absolutely certain of a sexuality other than normality. You see what we're saying, right? And she was very clear early on that she was a feminist and she was going to deliver her class in such and such and such a way. Her first assignment, a paper had to be written. My student wrote a paper. His thesis was, the problem with America is that women should be returned to the kitchen where they belong, doing the work of women, namely having children and learning how to make proper food for the husband. And he went on, you see. The next morning, he was assigned to stand in front of the entire class, a fairly large group, where this prof lambasted him for his views. He waited patiently and then made an observation, yea, two. His first observation was, I thought the University of Colorado Boulder was an institution of higher learning that treasured alternate views. And I thought I was an American citizen who just came back from conquests of battle to preserve a thing called freedom, which means I should be allowed to say whatever I want to say at the University of Colorado Boulder, whether you agree with it or not. Point two, are you at all familiar with satire? Say one thing and mean something else. Let's talk about satire. What is it other than say one thing, mean something else? Well, it was invented long ago. Shall we say it? The Romans really got into this project. And we have two really classic Romans who did this project. And now I'm with you there on 596, 597. There's kind of two ways to think about satire on 597. The first is by a guy named Horace. The second by a cat named Juvenal. Now, when we talk about these two different kinds of satire, we talk about them as Horatian and Juvenalian satire. Horatian satire is gentle satire. It's when you make fun of somebody and the somebody you make fun of laughs along. For example, 3A observation. When Chaucer says about the nun that she was by no means undergrown, in other words, she's a fairly corpulent lass, you see. She was by no means undergrown. She had, if you will, conquered anorexia, if you get my drift, right? When Chaucer said that. When he says that about the prioress, that is an example of Horatian satire. It's kind of soft, it's kind of gentle satire. The prioress herself would probably have to admit that one or two donuts could have gone uneaten, you see. But there's a second kind of satire that we will call Juvenalian satire. Juvenalian satire, you bring out the big bad, and it comes right into the forehead cranium of the reader, and there is no getting away from it. It's going to hit you right in the face, and it's going to offend, as of course our University of Colorado Boulder prof quickly found. Juvenalian satire is almost always initially overlooked, and there is going to be a shock value involved. Now, the project of next Monday is for you to write a satire. Two observations. One, let's make sure we understand exactly what that means. Two, let's look at a classic model, namely Swift's Modest Proposal. First of all, the project for you. You are to select some topic about which you are offended, upset, would like to see changed. In the classic example of my student, she didn't like the fact that everyone was hanging on everyone in early spring, showing signs of public displays of affection, led her to write her classic satiric piece, which got our paper shut down, I fear. The project for you then is to begin by asking, what kind of torques me off? What kind of upsets me? There is not enough parking at Worland High School, for example. But, now number two, you have to write a paper in which you are going to argue the opposite of what you're saying. If your thesis is, there's not enough parking at Worland High School, then you actually, in a satiric piece, will write how amazing the parking spaces are at Worland High School. You feel like you are at Denver International Airport with all of the available parking. That is satire. Do you understand? Now, the same rules apply in terms of fundamental essay composition. You still are going to come up with 3 points of validation as to why it is you believe this, okay? For example, my student had 3 articulate reasons as to why women should be all returned to the kitchen where they are doing their job, you see. He had 3 clear ideas as to why. So the guidelines of essay writing are all the same. It's just that your thesis is now satiric. Final point. At no point in your essay do you ever say, this is satire. Okay, that defeats the purpose. Do you got me? In other words, you don't say, hey, I'm really upset about the public displays of affection, and so I'm going to write a piece of satire now for you in which I suggest that we should probably have a room where people can go and do anything they want, blah, blah, blah. That defeats the purpose of the satire. But what about being misunderstood? Right. That's right. Whether it's Juvenalian or Horatian satire, there's always the chance, and this is why it's risky, this is why we call it going through the back screen door, not through the front door, where somebody has to answer the door and meet you. Going through the back door, nobody's expecting this kind of approach compositionally, and it's going to often be misunderstood, which is why you got to be very careful with it. My student with his Boulder Prof is a classic example. He ended up having to drop the class. She was not pleased that he had humiliated her in front of the entire class by teaching her about satire, a topic she was to lecture in a few days, hence on her course outline. And so that didn't go over very well at all. You see how that works. So satire sometimes can get you in some hot water, which you already know. If, for example, you are a joker, witty kind of person where you say things and people take you seriously and the whole time you're actually joking, you know how that can get you into some trouble, especially if they don't have a point of reference and they really do think, like they don't know you, and they really do think that you're serious. They can get really fired up really fast. Then you have to explain to them, dude, I'm just messing with you. And then, of course, sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work, right? I mean, fooling people, sometimes being punked, as we see online and on TV. Sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's not very funny to the person who gets punked, right? So let's go now to a classic example. We are looking now at one of the penultimate classic examples. I'm going to say this. It is the classic example of satire of all examples. And it's called A Modest Proposal. It's about a 20-minute read. And we're going to try and listen to it in its entirety, but I want to give you a couple of heads up as you get ready. England and Ireland had never had very good history relationship. England was basically the conqueror of Ireland. They began to impose certain kinds of taxes on the people of Ireland, and then the famous potato famine hit. And large numbers of Irish people began to starve to death. Jonathan Swift was reading in the paper stories that were horrific, where little girls, for example, were being sold into prostitution on the streets of Dublin at the age of 5 and 6 so that the parents could get 1 penny, so that they could try and make some money, because the children were starving to death. England's response? Raise taxes. No kidding. Swift is traveling through Ireland and sees the horror of all of this and returns, and he writes a classic essay called Modest Proposal, where he says 3 things. 1, it's really bad in Ireland right now when everybody's starving to death. 2, every year there's about 120,000 kids nobody wants. Nobody wants these kids. Therefore, if somebody could come up with a solution to this problem, he deserves a monument in the middle of town. 3, I got a solution. It's the best solution going. Let's eat the kids. We'll eat them. 120,000 of them every year, nobody wants. Let's eat them. We can think of it this way. It's a beautiful import-export idea. We'll raise children. By the way, Swift says he got his idea from the Americans because they're in the colonists. Remember the timeline here when he writes this thing. Franklin and Jefferson are outraged that he would say this. Yeah, those guys over in the colonists over there, they've been eating their kids for a long time apparently. So this is no, we'll be able to sell our kids to them. It'll be an import-export business. You'll be able to use all parts of the kid, including the skin. You can make handbags and gloves. It'll be awesome. And then he goes into detail. The looks on your faces tell me that some of you have not read this passage. I'm not insulting. I'm just saying it gets dark at night obvious. There's a reason sometimes to read before you come to class, because then you can enjoy it on your own. Swift's modest proposal is intended. It's a piece of Juvenalian satire. It is intended to reach out and grab you by the throat and shake you. It did that very thing. But let's point out something. The satiric suggestion works in every way. Let's point out the obvious. It works in every way. Right? There are 120,000 kids nobody wants. That is undebatable. Everybody knew that in Swift's day. You're not going to do anything with these kids. Let's eat them before the age of 1. Dude, before the age of 1, they won't even know they were in existence, much less that they were killed to be eaten. Drive through Arby's and ask for your children's fingers with soy sauce, you see. Guys, it works. It works in every way. Can I say it again? Every way. Every single one of Swift's observations is absolutely correct. There's only one problem with his proposal. What is it? Eating children is what? It's immoral. It's wrong. But nowhere in the essay does Swift ever ask the obvious question, which is more immoral? To sell your 5-year-old little girl into prostitution or to eat her before she's 1? Which is more immoral of those two? See, he doesn't have to ask that question in this essay, and in the process, this essay had tremendous effect. Immediately, the taxing situation went away. Makes sense. It was so graphic. It was so powerful. Swift ending by saying, you know, I'd like to be the first one to volunteer my child for this project, but alas, she's too old, and so, you know, too old to be eaten. So, you know, but if you can come up with a better idea than this one, I'm happy to hear it. Brutal, brutal. Why is this essay still popular today? I'll say this, then we'll listen to it. Last night, on the streets of cities of your country, and there we will stay, you do realize there were over 50,000 children who slept on the streets. We're not talking about in shelters. On the streets of America's cities last night. 50,000 kids under the age of 7. Last night. In your country. We're not talking about Rio de Janeiro, where last night the number is somewhere close to 2 million. We're not talking about that. Or somewhere in China where the number is closer to even 8 million. We're not talking about those populations. We're talking about in the United States of America last night. That is a disturbing statistic. And it clearly begs a question. What do you do with all the kids nobody wants? I mean, really? What do you do with all those kids? Swift's essay seems to say, well, you got to do something or you eat them. And if you don't do something, you might as well eat them. Brutal. And yet very unsettling. I think worthy of consideration, though, don't you think? Sometimes, by the way, my seniors will say, well, okay, you raised the question, so what is the answer? What do you do with all of the pain and suffering of children in the world? My answer is the Francis Bacon answer. It's the answer of Mr. Stott yesterday. Go make wealth. Get power, get money, and a lot of it, and then use it to make the world a better place. While everybody else parties for the 4 or 5 years of university, work, make money, invest it, make wealth, and then by the time you're 30, use it. Become part of systems where you have power, and then use that power to improve the human condition. I have a question for you. If you don't do it that way, how will you do it? There is another option, to pretend like the statistic I just shared with you didn't really happen. It's not a real good answer, though, because we know it happened. Are you ready for this? There were some kids in this town last night, that didn't have a meal. That is true. That is true, okay? So pain and suffering of children is everywhere in our country. Do something to try and help it, to alleviate it in some way. Make sense? Let's go now to page 610. Take a look at Mata's proposal. If we can finish, we will. We'll read right up until the end of the hour. Enjoy the satirical piece here.
Preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden.
You're going to have to follow close, though. It's not easy prose.
Jonathan Swift.
In Amata's proposal, Jonathan Swift suggests an unorthodox solution to the problem of desperate poverty in 18th century Ireland. As you read, think about the real message of his satirical essay.
It is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country, when they see the streets, the roads, and cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags and importuning every passenger for an alms. These mothers, instead of being able to work for their honest livelihood, are forced to employ all their time in strolling to beg sustenance for their helpless infants, who, as they grow up, either turn thieves for want of work, or leave their dear native country to fight for the Pretender in Spain, or sell themselves to the Barbados. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound, useful members of the Commonwealth would deserve so well of the public as to have his statue set up for a preserver of the nation. But my intention is very far from being confined to provide only for the children of professed beggars. It is of a much greater extent, and shall take in the whole number of infants at a certain age, who are born of parents, in effect, as little able to support them as those who demand our charity in the streets. As to my own part, having turned my thoughts for many years upon this important subject, and maturely weighed the several schemes of other projectors, I have always found them grossly mistaken in their computation. It is true, a child just dropped from its dam may be supported by her milk for a solar year, with little other nourishment, at most not above the value of 2 shillings, which the mother may certainly get, or the value in scraps, by her lawful occupation of begging. And it is exactly at 1 year old that I propose to provide for them in such a manner as, instead of being a charge upon their parents or the parish, or wanting food and raiment for the rest of their lives, they shall, on the contrary, contribute to the feeding and partly to the clothing of many thousands. There is likewise another great advantage in my scheme, that it will prevent those voluntary abortions and that horrid practice of women murdering their bastard children, alas, too frequent among us, sacrificing the poor innocent babes, I doubt, more to avoid the expense than the shame, which would move tears and pity in the most savage and inhuman breast. The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned 1.5 million, of these I calculate there may be about 200,000 couple whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couples who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend there cannot be so many under the present distresses of the kingdom. But this being granted, there will remain 170,000 breeders. I again subtract 50,000 for those women who miscarry, or whose children die by accident or disease within the year. There only remain 120,000 children of poor parents annually born. The question, therefore, is how this number shall be reared and provided for, which, as I have already said, under the present situation of affairs, is utterly impossible by all the methods hitherto proposed. For we can neither employ them in handicraft or agriculture, we neither build houses, I mean in the country, nor cultivate land. They can very seldom pick up a livelihood by stealing till they arrive at 6 years old, except where they are of towardly parts. Although I confess they learn the rudiments much earlier, during which time they can, however, be looked upon only as probationers. As I have been informed by a principal gentleman in the county of Cavan, who protested to me that he never knew above 1 or 2 instances under the age of 6, even in a part of the kingdom so renowned for the quickest proficiency in that art. I am assured by our merchants that a boy or girl before 12 years old is no saleable commodity. And even when they come to this age, they will not yield above 3 pounds, or 3 pounds and half a crown at most on the exchange, which cannot turn to account either to the parents or the kingdom, the charge of nutriment and rags having been at least 4 times that value. I shall now, therefore, humbly propose my own thoughts,
Humbly.
which I hope will not be liable to the least objection.
I hope I don't upset you.
I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London
Ouch.
that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. I do therefore humbly offer it to public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. And my reason is that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages. Therefore, 1 male will be sufficient to serve 4 females. That the remaining 100,000 may at a year old be offered in sale to the persons of quality and fortune through the kingdom, always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper or salt will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. I have reckoned upon a medium that a child just born will weigh 12 pounds, and in a solar year, if tolerably nursed, increaseth to 28 pounds. I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. Infant's flesh will be in season throughout the year, but more plentiful in March and a little before and after. For we are told by a grave author, an eminent French physician, that fish being a prolific diet, there are more children born in Roman Catholic countries about 9 months after Lent than at any other season. Therefore, reckoning a year after Lent, the markets will be more glutted than usual, because the number of popish infants is at least 3 to 1 in this kingdom, and therefore it will have one other collateral advantage by lessening the number of papists among us. I have already computed the charge of nursing a beggar's child, in which list I reckon all cottagers, laborers, and 4/5 of the farmers, to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included. And I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good, fat child, which, as I have said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat, when he hath only some particular friend or his own family to dine with him. Thus the squire will learn to be a good landlord and grow popular among the tenants. The mother will have 8 shillings net profit and be fit for work till she produces another child. Those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. As to our city of Dublin, shambles may be appointed for this purpose in the most convenient parts of it, and butchers, we may be assured, will not be wanting, although I rather recommend buying the children alive and dressing them hot from the knife as we do roasting pigs. A very worthy person, a true lover of his country, and whose virtues I highly esteem, was lately pleased in discoursing on this matter to offer a refinement upon my scheme. He said that many gentlemen of this kingdom, having of late destroyed their deer, he conceived that the want of venison might be well supplied by the bodies of young lads and maidens, not exceeding 14 years of age nor under 12. So great a number of both sexes in every county being now ready to starve for want of work and service, and these to be disposed of by their parents, if alive, or otherwise by their nearest relations. But with due deference to so excellent a friend and so deserving a patriot, I cannot be altogether in his sentiments. For as to the males, my American acquaintance assured me from frequent experience that their flesh was generally tough and lean, like that of our schoolboys, by continual exercise, and their taste disagreeable, and to fatten them would not answer the charge. Then as to the females, it would, I think, with humble submission, be a loss to the public, because they soon would become breeders themselves. And besides, it is not improbable that some scrupulous people might be apt to censure such a practice, although indeed very unjustly, as a little bordering upon cruelty, which I confess hath always been with me the strongest objection against any project, how well soever intended. But in order to justify my friend, he confessed that this expedient was put into his head by the famous Salmanazar, a native of the island Formosa, who came from thence to London above 20 years ago, and in conversation told my friend that in his country, when any young person happened to be put to death, the executioners sold the carcass to persons of quality as a prime dainty, and that in his time the body of a plump girl of 15, who was crucified for an attempt to poison the emperor, was sold to His Imperial Majesty's Prime Minister of State and other great mandarins of the court in joints from the gibbet at 400 crowns. Neither indeed can I deny that if the same use were made of several plump young girls in this town, who without one single groat to their fortunes cannot stir abroad without a chair, and appear at the playhouse and assemblies in foreign fineries which they never will pay for, the kingdom would not be the worse. Some persons of a desponding spirit are in great concern about that vast number of poor people who are aged, diseased, or maimed, and I have been desired to employ my thoughts what course may be taken to ease the nation of so grievous an encumbrance. But I am not in the least pain upon that matter, because it is very well known that they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine, and filth and vermin, as fast as can be reasonably expected. And as to the younger laborers, they are now in almost as hopeful a condition. They cannot get work, and consequently pine away for want of nourishment, to a degree that if at any time they are accidentally hired to common labor, they have not strength to perform it, and thus the country and themselves are happily delivered from the evils to come. I have too long digressed, and therefore shall return to my subject. I think the advantages by the proposal which I have made are obvious and many, as well as of the highest importance. For first, as I have already observed, it would greatly lessen the number of papists with whom we are yearly overrun, being the principal breeders of the nation as well as our most dangerous enemies, and who stay at home on purpose to deliver the kingdom to the pretenders, hoping to take their advantage by the absence of so many good Protestants, who have chosen rather to leave their country than stay at home and pay tithes against their conscience to an episcopal curate. Secondly, the poorer tenants will have something valuable of their own, which by law may be made liable to distress, and help to pay their landlord's rent, their corn and cattle being already seized and money a thing unknown. Thirdly, whereas the maintenance of 100,000 children from 2 years old and upwards cannot be computed at less than 10 shillings apiece per annum, the nation's stock will be thereby increased £50,000 per annum, besides the profit of a new dish introduced to the tables of all gentlemen of fortune in the kingdom, who have any refinement in taste. And the money will circulate among ourselves, the goods being entirely of our own growth and manufacture. Fourthly, the constant breeders, besides the gain of 8 shillings sterling per annum by the sale of their children, will be rid of the charge of maintaining them after the first year. Fifthly, this food would likewise bring great custom to taverns, where the vintners will certainly be so prudent as to procure the best receipts for dressing it to perfection, and consequently have their